I've been reading a meditation from a book of story meditations by Anthony DeMello, different one every day. And the advice from Tony DeMello is, this is for me, not for somebody else. It applies to me. And the one that I read the day that I started preparing for this homily, a parachutist jumped out of a plane into a gale, and he was blown 100 miles away and ended up hanging in a tree. Very lonely place, and his hollers for help were seemingly wasted. And finally someone came along and looked up in the tree and said, "What are you doing up in that tree?" And the person said, "Where am I?" And he said, "You're hanging in that tree." He said, "Are you a cleric?" The man said, "Well, yes, I am. How did you know?" "Because what you just said is certainly true, and just as certainly useless." So I realized that I had to do something here today that you might find useful. With the parable, Jesus tells us that the Pharisees got it all wrong. You're going to lose the kingdom of heaven, is what he told them. Who were the Pharisees? Pharisees studied Scripture and the law. They tried to assure that all Jews knew and kept the law, and this would please God. Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian, described Pharisees as a body of Jews who professed to be more religious than the rest and to explain the law more precisely. Saul of Tarsus was a Pharisee. And in today's epistle, he says he was a great Pharisee, a perfect Pharisee, and a zealous one. You know about his conversion. Paul says, "All these things that I did before my encounter with Christ were rubbish, useless, worthless." What was wrong with him as a Pharisee? And how did Paul, a former Pharisee, write in 1 Corinthians, "If I speak in the tongues of angels and mortals, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing." Thinking about this, the Pharisees had some problem with love. They didn't seem to have any love or compassion in what they said and did. It was all following rules. "You shall love your neighbor as yourself" was not one of the commandments in today's reading from Exodus. That phrase comes in Leviticus. Now, was it possible that the Pharisees never knew about the readings in Leviticus? I suspect it was. Jesus repeats that phrase, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," in Mark. He's speaking to a scribe, not a Pharisee. And the scribe acknowledges Jesus as a great leader, reader, and he understood, had all knowledge of the Scriptures. Now, the scribes were the people, like theologians, who study Scriptures and interpret them. But the Pharisees did not have this information. They had perhaps no concept of a loving God. The Pharisees didn't seem to include love or compassion in their application of the rules. Absolute obedience was what they were looking for, particularly of the Sabbath. Most of the stories about encounters that Jesus had with the Pharisees happened on the Sabbath. And the Pharisee was objecting to what Jesus was doing, not because of what he was doing, but because it violated the rules of the Sabbath. So there was no love or compassion permitted. In the baptismal covenant, the celebrant asks us, will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbors as yourself? And we say, we will. Actually, we say, we will with God's help. In the prayers for the candidates, the leader says, teach them to love others in the power of the Spirit. And we say, Lord, hear our prayer. We admit we need God's help to love others. Maybe we just don't think to ask often enough. Excuse me. Some deterrents that I feel in my life about love is emotion. I had 4 years at the Coast Guard Academy. We started learning to control emotions. One of the ways that we did this as a first-year cadet, at mealtime, evening meal, one of the first-year cadets was required to tell a joke, and they never got a laugh. As an upperclassman, found out how difficult it was not to laugh at a funny joke, because you don't want to let that person know that they've told you a funny joke. So that's part of your learning of controlling your emotions, not necessarily not having the emotions, but not displaying them. In a 30-year Coast Guard career, number of occasions when there's a situation where you can't allow people to know that you're confused, you're concerned, deeply concerned, maybe even a little bit afraid. So you hide those emotions. And when you're used to hiding emotions, it becomes difficult not to. And maybe some of us have that problem. But without feeling and displaying emotion, it may be impossible to love. Fortunately, after I think I'd been commissioned for 10 years when I first started going to church regularly in Virginia. And we went to a small church that had split off from a huge church, the Falls Church of Falls Church, Virginia. And this group had been struggling building their parish hall, which they hoped would one day be a parish hall, and they would build a church beside it. But we were celebrating the services in the parish hall. And these people had worked very hard, putting together this building, paying off the mortgage, painting, and doing the cleanup. I was called twice to help a men's group and had an excuse for both times and said no. The third time, persistence pays. I said, okay. I didn't have any good reason not to, so I went and joined this group. That was a very fortunate day in my life. I found out that there were some people who weren't in the Coast Guard that were really great people. And I enjoyed working with them and getting to know them. Along the way, I got involved in some things that began to show me that I needed to loosen up a little bit on the emotional side. I made a Cursillo retreat, a 3-day short course in Christianity that I found very interesting. But then I started being a team member and went to team meetings, and we found out that we had to get to know each other. And in order to put on one of these weekends, you really had to love your teammates, no matter what you thought of them. Because that was the message you were going to convey to the people that attended the weekend. Now, a step above that, and Don has talked about it, and I've talked about it before, going into prison with that type of weekend was an awesome experience. A prison, my feeling the first time I stepped inside a prison, this is a vacuum as far as love is concerned. It just disappeared as soon as the doors locked. And we went into this room with a bunch of people in blue, knowing that they had done something pretty serious. A lot of these people had killed somebody. A lot of these people were serious drug dealers. Some of them still addicts. But we went in, the same process. We went in with a team of about 30 people, and we all met regularly to get to love and trust each other, because we were going to have to convey that message to the people in blue. You can love us and you can trust us. It does some miraculous things. One of the things that happened to me, a friend of mine told me that he was flying from West Coast to East Coast about once a week, and he took the red eye, and he said that he always prayed before the flight that he would meet somebody to share his Christianity with. And one time he did that, and the man had no interest in the church at all before he met Frank. And he wound up over there with with the men's breakfast. And I decided to apply this one time. I was flying to Washington, D.C. from San Francisco. And so I'd prayed. It was 747, the 5 seats in the middle. I was in the seat, one seat in from the aisle. And there was a woman on my left. I had a Christian book that I was going to read, and she noticed it. And I thought, oh, this is my answer. The empty seat on the aisle was a 6-year-old girl came in and sat down. And across the aisle was her older brother and younger sister. And they were being sent by their single mother, who wanted to get to know her boyfriend better, to Washington, D.C. to stay with an aunt and uncle. We shared all the way across. Shortest flight I ever had. As we're approaching D.C., she said, "I wish I could go home with you." But I assured her that her aunt and uncle would love her and take good care of her. And I watched after we landed and picked up luggage and saw who picked her up. And it was a Navy Chief Petty Officer. And I felt confident that she was in good hands. So I hope it's useful to you to know that we need to work on it. We need to ask for God's help. But it's vital that we love one another. That's what the kingdom is. Thank you.